Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories. We have stories that should thrill you a little and chill you a little.
It's amazing.
What you'll hear are adventures sent in by you guys, classic stories from the pulp mags, and episodes from the golden age of radio. We have special segments like Ghost Stories with Sylvia.
That's amazing.
And These Are Your Stories. So settle in for the next hour and enjoy the show. One more thing. You just might want to prepare yourself to be taken away from today.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by our 600th episode. That's right, we've hit that magical number of 600.
Wow, Ron. Grats on that. I bet you have something amazing today.
Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. But first, here is our story.
I tell you, Janice, it's got to be slick.
No, it won't work, Roger. It's too uncertain.
But there's nothing to go wrong. Now listen. Those custom boys are used to naive, stupid smuggling. We've got to be smart, that's all.
And you think your idea is?
Look, Janice, why isn't it? We get on the boat. We're strangers. We never speak to each other. No one on the boat can connect us in any way. Now, I get off first, and right away I have my trunk and bags examined. By the time I'm through, you're off and you're waiting. Then...
Yes, but that timing. How can I be sure there won't be a lot of people under letter G and only me at K?
For heaven's sake, Janice, you can stall somehow. We'll be near enough to each other to see how things are going.
Okay.
Then I pick up my 3 bags and walk over toward you. I'm clumsy and I don't see where I'm going. I bump into you, and as I do, you drop my wallet. I pick it up.
With your hands full of bags, I suppose.
Well, maybe you pick it up. We don't have to rehearse a scene like that. If anyone thinks he sees you drop it, my initials and identification will prove it's mine, especially as I've just been through the customs. It'll look as if I had it in my hand.
Sounds good, Roger.
Good, it's perfect. Why, with the diamond market the way it is, we'll clean up in America, honey.
Roger, if this works, you're a genius.
That all you want to declare, Mr. Griswold?
That's all.
You're clear then, Mr. Griswold. Guess you're glad to be home.
I certainly am. More than you can guess.
Yeah, it must be pretty tough in Lisbon, even for Americans. Oh, can you manage that packing by yourself?
Oh, yes, thanks. I must be clumsy about this now. There's Janice, good girl. She's just arrived. Fine. Well, here we go.
Oh!
I beg your pardon.
Well, why don't you look where you're going? Oh, just a minute. I think you dropped this wallet.
What? Oh, yes. I guess I did. Oh, thanks very much.
Wait a minute there. He didn't drop that, miss. You did.
Oh, no, you're mistaken. That isn't my wallet.
Well, indeed it isn't.
I saw you drop it, miss. Say, what's going on here?
Oh, nothing's going on. This gentleman ran into me and dropped his wallet, and I picked it up, and that's all.
How do you know it's his wallet?
Because his initials are on it.
Oh, they are they? What are your names?
Janice Kite.
I'm Roger Griswold, but I don't
Well,
see...
Janice Kite and Roger Griswold, you're both under arrest for smuggling. How did the customs official discover their trick? In just a minute, we'll hear. First, a word from our sponsor.
Griswold, huh? I have to wonder if they were on vacation or something.
You don't. They were diamond smugglers from Lisbon.
Yes, but... Oh, never mind. I thought that plan was wonderful. Not sure how it went wrong.
Were you born with a turnip in your head?
No, not that I know of. Is that even possible?
In your case, I think so.
Either way. You know, a friend of mine is sad because he lost his favorite root vegetable.
I'm sure it will turnip.
And now, back to our story.
Look here, you can't arrest me for smuggling.
Well, you remember I asked you, Miss Kite, how you knew it was his wallet that had dropped.
Yes.
You said you knew it was his because his initials were on it.
Well, aren't they?
Yes, his initials are there all right, but on the inside. And when the wallet dropped to the floor, it didn't fall open, so you couldn't have seen them. Therefore, I knew you had previous knowledge of them. Yes, you two had a nice little package of 15 diamonds in that wallet. And now, how about a free ride to the station house?
Well, at least they got a free ride.
To the station house.
Sounds like a nice restaurant to me.
In the 40s, that was the police station.
Oh dear.
You see, even in the 40s, smuggling got you 10 years in prison.
Oh dear.
Yeah, so don't do it.
I won't.
And you kids out there, stay in school.
What's that you say?
Hello and welcome to the podcast. Well, this is show number 600. Normally I would have all kinds of fanfare guests and probably some skits and stories. But this time around I'm just going to take it in and think, man, have I really done 600 podcasts? I think back to episode 1 of the show. It was really not very good, and I didn't have any idea of what I was doing or where it was all going to lead. I had a kind of plan and, well, heck, let me play you a minute or so of that show, and I think you'll get the idea. Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is episode 1 of Ron's Amazing Stories. Since this is the first edition, I thought I should take a moment and talk about what to expect from this weekly podcast. It is my hope to bring you stories of all types. We will have old-time radio, dramatic readings, and even some real-life stories. I will also be looking for you to send me feedback telling me what you liked and what you didn't. That way, we get the show just the way we want it. The end result should be an interesting journey. You can email me at ronald@editwriteforyou.com. That's EDITRIGHT, the number 4 and the letter U. You can also head over to the website www.editwriteforyou.com. Click on the blog and podcast tab and leave feedback there. Podcasting is very new to me and I'm bound to make some mistakes. One thing you should know is I love to learn, and we will get any bugs worked out quickly and efficiently. So enough of this. Let's get started with our very first story. The very first bit of feedback I got was that the intro music was way too long. I changed that fairly soon. The second thing I had to do was upgrade that mic and learn to breathe properly. That took a bit longer. Then I had to shorten and uncomplicate that web address. I didn't get any mail because people had no idea how to type it out. But the general idea of what I said that day is still what we do today. Just a little bit better, I hope. Now, for those of you who like all the fanfare of the celebration guests and skits, not to worry. I'm working on a series of short segments dedicated to the life, times, and history of Ron's Amazing Stories. I'm going to bring back some of the folks that made it all happen, relive some of the very best moments, and I even have a gag reel. Amazing, but not everything went as planned. However, next up for the podcast is hopefully Ghost Stories with Sylvia. She's been in Europe doing, you guessed it, ghost hunting. So what are we going to do on this show? Well, we have an audiobook review of an Audible original, 3 brand new stories sent in by you for you, a story read and suggested to us from James, and much more. So hang around and enjoy the show. Happy 600th. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. Audible has sponsored the show now since July of 2019. We have reviewed more than 140 audiobooks, and the list keeps growing. Did you know that Audible has over 200,000 books available? And a lot of those are included in the free catalog. Audible is amazing, and it is the perfect companion to Ron's Amazing Stories. If you like this podcast, you're going to love Audible. So what am I listening to? The Dispatcher. From the master storyteller and Hugo Award winner John Scalzi comes this Audible original. What makes it notable is that Emmy-nominated actor Zachary Quinto, best known for his role as Spock in the Star Trek reboot, brings his well-earned sci-fi credentials and simmering intensity to this genre-bending thriller. Here's a clip from the opening to the story.
Chapter 1. I take it as a given that no one really likes to see me in my official capacity, but Dr. Chow seemed more annoyed than most when I showed up for the open heart surgery she was performing. "Tell me that's not the person I think it is," Chow said to Sheila Reeves. Reeves, a hospital administrator, had accompanied me into the scrub room. Chow was scrubbing up and after the initial glance refused to look at me. Several other members of the operating team were in the scrub room as well, prepping for the operation. They seemed happy to be thinking about other business. "Helen," Reeves began, "you know my policy on non-essential personnel in my operating room." "He's technically not non-essential." "Yeah?" Chow said, and then addressed me without looking my way. "You, what's your name?" "Tony Valdez." "And you're a doctor, right? A specialist in heart surgery?" "No." "An anesthesiologist, then?" "I'm not a doctor of any sort." "Then you're a nurse, a surgical nurse?" "No, I'm not a nurse either." "So not a doctor, not a nurse." Chow pressed a dispenser with her elbow to get more soap on her hands. "Seems like he has no reason to be in my operating room, Sheila." "You know that's not how it works, Helen." "It's my operating room. It is how it works." "The insurance company insists on it. If he's not in the operating room, they won't pay." Chow glowered quietly for several seconds. I stood, also quiet. Years of practice told me the best thing to do in moments like these is not to speak unless spoken to, which I was, a second later. "Where's Jimmy Albert?" asked another woman to me. She was hovering over Chow, which made me assume she was a nurse or assistant of some sort. "Jimmy's usually the one of you who works this hospital." "He was called away on a personal emergency," I said. Or that's what he told me. I was on call this weekend, so this got handed to me. "You've worked hospitals and operations before," Reeves prompted me. "Of course, a dozen hospitals at least, and hundreds of operations. It's our primary job responsibility at this point." "And how many people have you killed doing your job?" Chow asked me. I could hear the quotation marks around the word job in her voice. "None so far. That's actually the point of my job, Dr. Chow." I had gotten her name from the assignment sheet I'd received a half hour earlier. Being on call meant catching up quickly. Notes from others who had worked with her mentioned she had a tendency toward hostility, which is why I stopped by Reeves' office and asked her to come up with me to the scrub room. "This is crap, Sheila," Chow said. She was done scrubbing and turned off the water with her elbows. "You know it's crap. Check my record. I've never had cause for one of them," she jerked her head in my direction, "to interfere with my work." Reeves had one of those set looks of patience that suggested to me that this was not the first time she'd had this discussion with Chow. "It's not up to me, Helen, you know it. The insurance insists on it. The family signed off on it. The law says that we have to allow him to be present in the operating room. And to interfere with the operation. He's allowed to intervene if necessary, yes. Intervene, hell, interfere. Chow jabbed an elbow at me. This jackass has no medical experience at all. He's not even a nurse, no offense, she said to the nurse near her, who gave the briefest of nods. And you're trying to tell me he's in some way competent to make a medical judgment? I checked his rating, Helen. He's exemplary in all categories, across the board. And that means exactly nothing, because he's not a doctor. You're taking away my right to give the best care I can to my patients, and all you have to say about it is the insurance insists on it. It's crap, Sheila. It's crap, and I shouldn't have to work this way. No surgeon should have to. You and I don't disagree, Helen, but the point is it doesn't matter whether I agree with you or not. It doesn't matter if you like the policy. We have to allow him into the room. If we don't and something goes wrong, the hospital is open to being sued for negligence, and so are you. We have this argument every single time. It doesn't change. You could make the hospital policy not allow them in surgery at all. We could, yes. And then we'd go bankrupt because insurers wouldn't refer their patients to us, and the U.S. government wouldn't allow us to handle Medicaid cases, as you know. Chow stared angrily at Reeves, and then finally looked over to me. Your name again? She said. Tony Valdez.
While interesting, that clip really doesn't give you any idea of what this story is about. One day, not too long from now, it becomes almost impossible to murder anyone. Why? Well, 999 times out of 1,000, anyone who is killed comes back to life. How? Well, we don't know, but it changes everything. War, crime, daily life. Tony Valdez is a professional dispatcher, a licensed assassin. His job is to humanely dispose of people in death's crosshairs to offer them a second chance at avoiding the Reaper. When a friend and fellow dispatcher goes missing, Valdez is plugged into a web of intrigue, both professional and personal. It's a race against time for Valdez to find his friend before it's too late, before not even a dispatcher can save him. If you know of Zachary's work, you know he's an excellent actor. Even Leonard Nimoy himself approved of his portrayal of Spock. His work on this story is outstanding, and he brings a professionalism that is, well, amazing. I highly recommend this fascinating story, and you won't regret your time spent on it. It wouldn't surprise me to see this one made into a full-length feature film. Now, if any of that appeals to you, head to audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories, and you can have The Dispatcher for free. Here is what Audible has set up for us. They are offering a free audiobook and 30 days to give you the opportunity to check out the service. This also grants you access to the included catalog, which is updated constantly with new titles. So, to download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. Thank you, Audible. And now, it's time for more of your stories.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
Our first story for this week comes from Annabeth Gilmesh from Glendale, Arizona. This is not a long story, but it packs a punch. I'm not a fan of the heat in Arizona, but I will say we get some of the best stories from there. Annie writes, Hello, Ron. First, let me say that my husband and I love the podcast. We never miss an episode. Your show is so unique, there's nothing quite like it out there. We decided that it was time to share our one and only UFO story. By the way, we refuse to use UAP. UFO has worked for centuries. why change it now? One Sunday morning in 1992, we decided to take a drive out to Lake Pleasant State Park. When we got there, I decided to take a video of some birds that were behaving strangely. They were flying in odd patterns back and forth. A strong light flashed in the east, so I swung my camera around and I started filming, trying to focus the lens. I knew it was something out of the ordinary, but thought it must be a low-flying plane. As it got closer, my husband said, "Annie, it's not making any noise." Sure enough, it was within a quarter of a mile, heading straight for us, and completely silent. We watched and filmed for a good long time. It was not moving fast, and we were getting excited. We were going to be the first people to get real solid evidence of a UFO. Just as it started to come into focus, it shot straight up into the air at an unbelievable rate and was gone. When we got home, we watched the film several times, and what we captured could have been anything from a weather balloon to a glider. Oh, and the last movement it made? Well, it was way too fast for 1992 tech to record. Do I believe it was a UFO? Well, we both do. Annie Gilmesh, Glendale, Arizona. Well, Annie, I would love to see that video if it still exists. I think that in 1992 most people were still using tape, but I'm not too sure about that. If you have a digital copy, please send it to me. For the record, the bird thing you saw is called a murmuration. Seeing hundreds, even thousands of birds flying together in a whirling, ever-changing pattern is a phenomenon of nature that amazes and delights anyone lucky enough to see it. Thank you for sharing your story. This next story comes from Leah Eftachia. Sorry if I didn't pronounce that right. I found many ways to say it and picked what I thought was the best one. Leah writes to us from Cleveland, Ohio. My aunt was diagnosed with various cancers. Back in 2020, during the COVID lockdown, she had a close call and we ended up living with her for half the year. During that time, my family had many paranormal experiences. Here are some of the more notable. My aunt rented the upstairs of a 6-bedroom house. My sister and I had to sleep in the living room because the other rooms were being used. My first paranormal experience at that house happened around 2:30 a.m. I could hear these footsteps walking down the hallway from the bedrooms into the living room kitchen area. Whatever or whoever it was stopped at the foot of the couch and then walked back down the hall. I was not the first one that heard this, as my cousin and aunt, who also lived there, reported hearing bodiless footsteps pace the hallway. A hot spot for the paranormal activity was the small bathroom. My cousins said that they'd heard things being moved around while they were showering. My experience happened while I was talking to my cousin and looking in the mirror applying makeup. My cousin turned around to sit on the edge of the tub, and then, out of nowhere, we both saw something yellow and small suddenly materialize out of thin air. We saw my sister's little Pokemon toy briefly floating in the air. Then it suddenly looked like it was placed down perfectly on the ground at a super fast speed. When we told everyone what had happened, my sister said that her Pokemon toy had been right next to her on the nightstand in the other room. A couple days later, my mom and I were sitting in the bedroom across the hall from that bathroom, talking. She was putting on her shoes while I was looking down at my phone. Then, abruptly, she said, "Did you see that?" And I said, "I did." We both saw a small black bouncy ball appear out of thin air. It looked as if it was thrown across the room, landed on the floor directly in front of us, and then went under the bed that we were sitting on. My mom was recovering from knee surgery at the time, so she asked me to get down and look under the bed to see if it was there. I was too afraid that I would see something looking back at me if I looked under the bed, so she got down and looked. Bottom line, there was nothing under the bed. Another experience I had occurred after a really long day of driving around to visit several family members in various cities. If you remember COVID, that was the thing that you drove to each house and honked as you drove by. I was exhausted by the time we got back to my aunt's house that night, so I went straight to bed. Just as I was beginning to fall asleep, I suddenly heard a baby's screaming cry. It sounded as if it was coming from downstairs, but the young couple renting the room below us, well, they didn't have any children. I asked my cousin and sister if they had heard a baby crying, to which they looked at me with puzzled expressions and replied that they hadn't heard anything. I was surprised because the crying was so very loud. The next morning I told my aunt about the crying baby, and she shared an experience that they'd had earlier that year while they were leaving for a very early morning doctor's appointment. Apparently, the night before there was a snowstorm. When they opened the front door to leave, they noticed little bare footprints in the snow the size of a child's walking away from the house. My cousin followed them to the sidewalk where they disappeared without a trace. They noted that there were no footprints walking back to the house. All in all, that was a very strange time in my life. My aunt beat cancer, and we all moved back to our home and have not had any experiences since. Leah Aftachia, Cleveland, Ohio. Well, I guess the first thing I would ask is if the footprints, the toys being tossed around the house, and the crying baby could have been the same ghost. Have you ever researched the house? Send me the address and I would be happy to do it. Thank you for sharing your experiences, Leah. Our last story comes from Desdemona Ladine. It must be our week for names I'm not too sure how to pronounce. I think I got that one right because it appears that it is a famous name in literature. I am told that Desdemona simply likes to be called Des. I work at a restaurant in a rural town in Michigan. Ghost hunters actually visited this place some years ago. I'm told that there are ghosts here. One is a little girl, the other is a man. My very first day I asked about the ghost because I'd heard about the show, and my coworker said, "Oh yeah, it's a little girl." She went on to say that she hits the thing we use to grab the pizzas out of the oven onto the floor. She also told me that she turns on the radio. I didn't believe it. That is, until this happened. It's a busy Friday night, and there's karaoke happening, so it's very loud. Above us upstairs is a condemned apartment that's always vacant. We hear something charge across the ceiling. It must have taken 6 unbelievably loud steps. They headed towards the stairs that led down into the kitchen. Next, we hear an entire shelf of pans slam to the ground in a spectacular explosion of stainless steel. These pans are about 3 feet long, 1 foot wide, and like 3 inches deep. I would guess the whole thing had to weigh about 40 pounds. I asked the manager who was across the room, "Did you hear that?" He looked at me like, "Are you kidding?" I knew it was the ghost, but I wanted confirmation that someone else had heard it too. The dishwasher, an 18-year-old girl, actually saw it happen. I saw her face, and it was priceless. In total, 4 people heard it run across the ceiling, and 1 person saw it throw the pans. I find it impossible to be skeptical in any way, shape, or form, unless someone was playing an elaborate prank. Desdemona Ladine, Michigan. Well, Des, I had to do some research on this one. I found the episode of Ghost Hunters that you referred to. It was titled The Whitney Restaurant, and it aired on August 17th, 2016. I watched the show, and things matched up really well. They talked about the footsteps and the falling pizza paddle, or turning peel as it's called, so there is some really good evidence to support your story. Thank you for sharing it. Well, that's it for this time. If you have a story that you'd like to share, like Des did, head to the main website at ronsamazingstories.com. Click on the story submission banner, leave your story, give it a title, and please tell me where you're from. I'll read it if I can. Our featured story is one that we've had on the show before, but it remains one of my favorites. It is a fact that we all have a mortality date. But what about the human race? I think it's pretty clear that we humans also have an expiration date as well. The question should be, what will we leave behind? Our story today explores that idea and gives one plausible answer. It is titled The Ultimate Experiment by Thornton Decay. It first appeared in Comet magazine in July of 1941. It's read for us by Nicodemus from LibriVox.org.
They were all gone now, the masters, all dead, and their atoms scattered to the never-ceasing winds that swept the great chrysolite city towers in ever-increasing fury. That had been the last wish of each as he had passed away, dying from sheer old age. True, they had fought on as long as they could to save their kind from utter extinction, but the comet that had trailed its poisoning wake across space to leave behind it upon Earth a noxious lethal gas vapor had done its work too well. No living soul breathed upon the Earth. No one lived here now but Chiron and his kind. And so, thought Chiron to himself, he might as well be a great unthinking robot, able to do only one thing, instead of the mental giant he was. So obsessed had he become with the task he had set himself to do. Yet in spite of a great loneliness and a strong fear of a final frustration, he worked on with the others of his people, hardly stopping for anything except the very necessities needed to keep his big body working in perfect coordination. Tirelessly he worked, for the masters had bred, if that is the word to use, fatigue and the need for restoration out of his race long decades ago. Sometimes, though, he would stop his work when the great red dying sun began to fade into the west, and his round eyes would grow wistful as he looked out over the great city that stretched in towering minarets and lofty spires of purest crystal blue for miles on every side. A fairy city of rarest hue and beauty. A city for the gods, and the gods were dead. Chiron felt at such times the great loneliness that the last master must have known. They had been kind, the masters, and Chiron knew that his people, as they went about their eternal tasks of keeping the great city in perfect shape for the masters who no longer needed it, must miss them as he did. Never to hear their voices ringing, never to see them again gathered in groups to witness some game or to play amid the silver fountains and flowery gardens of the wondrous city, made him infinitely saddened. It would always be like this, unless... But thinking, dreaming, reminiscing would not bring it all back, for there was only one answer to still the longing: work. The others worked and did not dream, but instead kept busy tending to the 1,001 tasks the master had set them to do, had left them doing when the last master perished. He too must remember the trust they had placed in his hands and fulfill it as best he could. From the time the great red eye of the sun opened itself in the east, until it disappeared in the blue haze beyond the chrysolite city, Chiron labored with his fellows. Then, at the appointed hour, the musical signals would peal forth their sweet, sad chimes, whispering good night to ears that would hear them no more, and all operations would halt for the night, just as it had done when the masters were here to supervise it. Then, when morning came, he would start once more trying, testing, experimenting with his chemicals and plastics, forever following labyrinth of knowledge, seeking for the great triumph that would make the work of the others of some real use. His hands molded the materials carefully, lovingly to a pattern that was set in his mind as a thing to cherish. Day by day, his experiments in their liquid baths took form under his careful modeling. He mixed his chemicals with the same loving touch, the same careful concentration and painstaking thoroughness, studying often his notes and analysis charts. Everything must be just so, lest his experiment not turn out perfectly. He never became exasperated at a failure or a defect that proved to be the only reward for his faithful endeavors, but worked patiently on toward a goal that he knew would ultimately be his. Then one day, as the great red sun glowed like an immense red eye overhead, Chiron stepped back to admire his handiwork. In that instant, the entire wondrous city seemed to breathe a silent prayer as he stood transfixed by the sight before him. Then it went on as usual, hurrying noiselessly about its business. The surface cars, empty though they were, fled swiftly about, supported only by the rings of magnetic force that held them to their designated paths. The gravoships raised from the tower dromes to speed silently into the eye of the red sun that was dying. No one now, Chiron thought to himself as he studied his handiwork. Then he walked unhurriedly to the cabinet in the laboratory corner and took from it a pair of earphones resembling those of a long-forgotten radio set. Just as unhurriedly, though his mind was filled with turmoil and his being with excitement, he walked back and connected the earphones to the box upon his bench. The phones dangled into the liquid bath before him as he adjusted them to suit his requirements. Slowly he checked over every step of his experiments before he went further. Then, as he proved them for the last time, his hand went slowly to the small knife switch upon the box at his elbow. Next he threw into connection the larger switch upon his laboratory wall, bringing into his laboratory the broadcast power of the chrysolite city. The laboratory generators hummed softly, drowning out the quiet hum of the city outside. As they built up, sending tiny living electrical impulses over the wires like minute currents that come from the brain, Chiron sat breathless, his eyes intent. Closer to his work he bent, watching lovingly, fearful lest all might not be quite right. Then his eyes took on a brighter light as he began to see the reaction. He knew the messages that he had sent out were being received and coordinated into a unit that would stir and grow into intellect. Suddenly the machine flashed its little warning red light and automatically snapped off. Chiron twisted quickly in his seat and threw home the final switch. This, he knew, was the ultimate test. On the results of the flood of energy impulses that he had set in motion rested the fulfillment of his success or failure. He watched with slight misgivings. This had never been accomplished before. How could it possibly be a success now? Even the masters had never quite succeeded at this final test. How could he, only a servant? Yet it must work, for he had no desire in life but to make it work. Then suddenly he was on his feet, eyes wide. From the two long coffin-like liquid baths, there arose two perfect specimens of the Homo sapiens. Man and woman they were, and they blinked their eyes in the light of the noonday sun, raised themselves dripping from the baths of their creation, and stepped to the floor before Chiron. The man spoke, the woman remained silent. "I am Adam too," he said, "created by you, Chiron, from a formula they left in their image. I was created to be a master, and she whom you also have created is to be my wife. We shall mate, and the race of man shall be reborn through us and others whom I shall help you create." The man halted at the last declaration he intoned, and walked smilingly toward the woman, who stepped into his open arms, returning his smile. Chiron smiled too, within his pumping heart. The words the man had intoned had been placed in his still pregnable mind by the teleteach phones and record that the last master had prepared before death had halted his experiments. The actions of the man toward the woman, Chiron knew, was caused by the natural constituents that went to form his chemical body and govern his humanness. He, Chiron, had created a living man and woman. The masters lived again because of him. They would sing and play and again people the magnificent chrysolite city because he loved them and had kept on until success had been his. But then why not such a turnabout? Hadn't they, the masters, created him, a superb thinking robot?
Well, a second beginning for the human race. I think that this is a pretty original story, especially when you consider that it was written in 1941. There was a lot going on in the world at the time, and many thought it was the end times. As it turned out, it was a new beginning and caused some of the greatest advances in technology in history. Whether that was good or bad is in the eyes of the beholder. I hope you enjoyed today's story.
Johnny, is this true?
As you know by now, I like to surf the internet to find the strange and unusual. I do this in the name of the podcast, but the truth is, I would do it anyway, even if there was no podcast. What you're about to hear is...
Johnny, is this true?
I will tell you a story and then ask the question, did I make it up or is it true? Your job is to decide. Let's get started.
Johnny, is this true?
I can't let the 600th episode slide by without doing something to celebrate it. And if you know me, I never do anything normal, so here we go. I'm going to give you some stories and facts from the show's history. All you have to do is decide if I made it up or is it true. Let's get started with the stuff. Fact number 1. One of the things that I have enjoyed over the years is having guest authors on the show. One of my favorites was R.A. Salvatore. I read more of his books than any author ever. Now, here is the fact. It took me over a year to get him on the show. I had to be persistent, patient, and ready at a moment's notice. Now that really couldn't have taken that long, right? Wrong. The guy is busier than a bee, and it really took that long to have him on the show. When the day finally came, I was so nervous. I was sure that I was going to screw it up. It didn't help that his publicist made it worse with all these rules I had to follow, and I was told I would only have 10 minutes. When he came on, I told him how nervous I was. The first thing he told me was to call him Bob and that he understood completely. He remembered the first time he had a meeting with George Lucas. Well, the interview went great, and you can hear it on episode number 68. One more thing. We were on the phone together for over 45 minutes. He is a great guy. Fact number 2. Another author I had on the show was Anthony James. This was one of my favorite interviews of all time, and you can hear it by listening to episode number 155. During the interview, I was playing around with a new thing to make the show better. It was called adaptive leveling. What it was supposed to do is keep the mic levels constant. Sounds great, doesn't it? Well, it didn't do that. While Anthony was telling a really funny story from Gunsmoke, the system adapted my mic level to make sure that you could hear my breathing. In fact, my breaths were so loud that it drowned Mr. James out almost completely. Now that has to be a made-up story. Unfortunately, it is not. I never used adaptive leveling again, and I had to learn a brand new skill. How to use high and low pass filters to take my breathing out of the interview. Still use that skill even today. One thing I have to say is that Anthony James had an amazing life, and I highly recommend his memoir, Acting My Face. I wanted to have him back on the show to kind of make up for it all, but unfortunately, he passed away from cancer. Fact number 3. Ron's Amazing Stories has more than 600 episodes. That can't be right. This is true. There were actually 2 spin-off podcasts that were short-lived, and I fudged the counting many times to make sure that certain numbers fell on certain dates. So if you were to actually count them all up, just how many shows are there? It's actually closer to 700. How about that? Fact number 4. Ron's Amazing Stories is heard by over 83,000 people per week and has over 1 million plays over the years. Well, the truth is, I can't really be sure about the 83,000 number. That's what my radio producer told me a few months ago. Since it really can't be tracked, I have to just believe that that's true. But as for the 1 million plays, that's confirmed. It averages out to about 100,000 people per year. Now, I have set some individual records that are kind of amazing. For instance, episode number 545 has the record at 26,000 views on YouTube, which really doesn't make any sense since I'm an audio podcast. But either way, for me, that's a really big number. Well, that's all I have for you for right now. Of course, I could have told you many more facts and numbers, but we'll be telling more of these stories and stuff in those upcoming new segments that I talked about at the top of the show. So for now, I want to thank you for listening to
Johnny, is this true?
As read by Amazing Stories, read by amazing people.
This time on As Read By, we have a story that is a cross between horror and science fiction. It was suggested by listener James Christopher and is read for us by him. This story first appeared in The Worlds of If magazine in January of 1962. It is titled An Incident on Route 12 and was written by James H. Schmidt. Like all the stories from the golden age of pulp fiction, this one has a tagline. It reads, "He was already a thief, prepared to steal again. What he didn't know was that he himself was only booty." Take it away, James.
Phil Garfield was 30 miles south of the little town of Redmond on Route 12 when he was startled by a series of sharp clanking noises. They came from under the Packer's hood. The car immediately began to lose speed. Garfield jammed down the accelerator, had a sense of sick helplessness at the complete lack of response from the motor. The Packard rolled on, getting rid of its momentum, and came to a stop. Phil Garfield swore shakily. He checked his watch, switched off the headlights, and climbed out into the dark road. A delay of even half an hour here might be disastrous. It was past midnight, and he had another 110 miles to cover to reach the small private airfield where Madge waited for him and the $30,000 in the suitcase on the Packard's front seat. If he didn't make it before daylight. He thought of the bank guard. The man had made a clumsy play at being a hero, and that had set the fool woman who had run screaming into their line of fire. 1 dead, perhaps 2. Garfield hadn't stopped to look at an evening paper, but he knew they were hunting for him. He glanced up and down the road. No other headlights in sight at the moment, no light from a building showing on the forested hills. He reached back into the car and brought out a suitcase, his gun, a big flashlight, and the box of shells which had been standing beside the suitcase. He broke the box open, shoved a handful of shells and the .38 into his coat pocket, then took suitcase and flashlight over to the shoulder of the road and set them down. There was no point in groping about under the Packard's hood. When it came to mechanics, Phil Garfield was a moron and well aware of it. The car was useless to him now, except as bait. But as bait, it might be very useful. Should he leave it standing where it was? No, Garfield decided. To anybody driving past, it would merely suggest a necking party, or a drunk sleeping off his load before continuing home. He might have to wait an hour or more before somebody decided to stop. He didn't have the time. He reached in through the window, hauled the top of the steering wheel toward him, and put his weight against the rear window frame. The Packard began to move slowly backwards at a slant across the road. In a minute or two, he had it in position, not blocking the road entirely, which would arouse immediate suspicion, but angled across it, lights out, empty, both front doors open and inviting a passerby's investigation. Garfield carried the suitcase and flashlight across the right-hand shoulder of the road, and moved up among the trees and undergrowth of the slope above the shoulder. Placing the suitcase between the bushes, he brought out the .38, clicked the safety off, and stood waiting. Some 10 minutes later, a set of headlights appeared speeding up Route 12 from the direction of Redmond. Phil Garfield went down on one knee before he came within range of the lights. Now he was completely concealed by the vegetation. The car slowed as it approached, braking nearly to a stop 60 feet from the stalled Packard. There were several people inside it. Garfield heard voices, then a woman's loud laugh. The driver tapped his horn inquiringly twice, moved the car slowly forward. As the headlights went past him, Garfield got to his feet among the bushes, took a step down towards the road, raising the gun. Then he caught the distant gleam of a second set of headlights approaching from Redmond. He swore under his breath and dropped back out of sight. The car below him reached the Packard, edged cautiously around it, rolled on with a sudden roar of acceleration. The second car stopped when still 100 yards away, the Packard caught in the motionless glare of its lights. Garfield heard the steady purring of a powerful motor. For almost a minute nothing else happened. Then the car came gliding smoothly on, stopped again no more than 30 feet to Garfield's left. He could see it now through the screening bushes, a big job, a long, low four-door sedan. The motor continued to purr. After a moment, a door on the far side of the car opened and slammed shut. A man walked quickly out into the beam of the headlights and started towards the Packard. Phil Garfield rose from his crouching position, the .38 in his right hand, flashlight in his left. If the driver was alone, the thing was now cinched. But if there was somebody else in the car, somebody capable of fast, decisive action, a slip in the next 10 seconds might cost him the sedan, and quite probably his freedom and life. Garfield lined up the .38 sights steadily on the center of the approaching man's head. He let his breath out slowly as the fellow came level with him in the road, and squeezed off one shot. Instantly he went bounding down the slope to the road. The bullet had flung the man sideways to the pavement. Garfield darted past him to the left, crossed the beam of the headlights, and was in darkness again on the far side of the road, snapping on his flashlight as he sprinted up to the car. The motor hummed quietly on. The flashlight showed the seats empty. Garfield dropped the light, jerked both doors open and turned, gun pointing into the car's interior. Then he stood still for a moment, weak and almost dizzy with relief. There was no one inside. The sedan was his. The man he had shot through the head lay face down on the road, his hat flung a dozen feet away from him. Route 12 still stretched out in dark silence to east and west. There should be time enough to clean up the job before anyone else came along. Garfield brought the suitcase down and put it on the right front seat of the sedan, then started back to get his victim off the road and out of sight. He scaled the man's hat into the bushes, bent down, grasped the ankles, and started to haul him towards the left side of the road where the ground dropped off sharply beyond the shoulder. The body made a high, squealing sound and began to writhe violently. Shocked, Garfield dropped the legs and hurriedly took the gun from his pocket, moving back a step. The squealing noise rose in intensity as a wounded man quickly flopped over twice like a struggling fish, arms and legs sawing about with startling energy. Garfield clicked off the safety, pumped 3 shots into his victim's back. The grisly squeals ended abruptly. The body continued to jerk for another second or two, then lay still. Garfield shoved the gun back into his pocket. The unexpected interruption had unnerved him. His hand shook as he reached down again for the stranger's ankles. Then he jerked his hands back and straightened up, staring. From the side of the man's chest, a few inches below the right arm, something like a black, thick stick 3 feet long protruded now from the material of the coat. It shone gleaming wetly in the light from the car. Even in that first uncomprehending instant, something in its appearance brought a surge of sick disgust to Garfield's throat. The stick bent slowly halfway down its length, forming a sharp angle, and its tip opened into what could have been 3 blunt black claws which scrabbled clumsily against the pavement. Very faintly, the squealing began again, and the body's back arched up as if another stick-like arm were pushing desperately against the ground beneath it. Garfield acted in a blur of horror. He emptied the .38 into the thing at his feet almost without realizing he was doing it. Then, dropping the gun, he seized one of the ankles, ran backward into the shoulder of the road, dragging the body behind him. In the darkness at the edge of the shoulder, he let go of it, stepped around to the other side, and with 2 frantically savage kicks sent the body plunging over the shoulder and down the steep slope beyond. He heard it crash through the bushes for some seconds, then stop. He turned and ran back to the sedan, scooping up his gun as he went past. He scrambled into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut behind him. His hand shook violently on the steering wheel as he pressed down the accelerator. The motor roared into life and the big car surged forward. He edged it past the Packard, cursing aloud in horrified shock. Jammed down the accelerator and went flashing up Route 12, darkness racing beside and behind him. What had it been? Something that wore what seemed to be a man's body like a suit of clothes, moving the body as a man moves, driving a man's car, roach-armed, roach-legged itself. Garfield drew a long, shuddering breath. Then, as he slowed for a curve, there was a spark of reddish light in the rearview mirror. He stared at the spark for an instant, braked the car to a stop, rolled down the window, and looked back. Far behind him along Route 12, a fire burned, approximately at the point where the Packard had stalled out, where something had gone rolling off into the road into the bushes. Something, Garfield added mentally, that found fiery automatic destruction when death came to it, so that its secrets would remain unrevealed. But for him the fire meant the end of a nightmare. He rolled the window up, took out a cigarette, lit it, and pressed the accelerator. In incredulous fright, he felt the nose of the car tilt upwards, headlights sweeping up from the road into the trees. Then the headlights winked out. Beyond the windshield, dark tree branches floated down towards him, the night sky beyond. He reached frantically for the door handle. A steel wrench clamped silently about each of his arms, drawing them in against his sides, immobilizing him there. Garfield gasped, looked up at the mirror, and saw a pair of faintly gleaming red eyes watching him from the rear of the car. Two of the things. The second one stood behind him out of sight, holding him. They had been in what had seemed to be a trunk compartment, and they had come out. The eyes in the mirror vanished. A moist black roach arm reached over the back of the seat beside Garfield, picked up the cigarette he had dropped, extinguished it with rather horribly human motions, then took up Garfield's gun and drew it back out of sight. He expected a shot, but none came. One doesn't fire a bullet through the suit one intends to wear. It wasn't until that thought occurred to him that tough Phil Garfield began to scream. He was still screaming minutes later when, beyond the windshield, the spaceship floated into view among the stars.
Creepy, yet cool. A bit of justice doled out by aliens. But what of the man that the creatures took over in the first place? And were the aliens on the run as well? That is something that will be left to our imaginations. And to be honest, that was one of the highlights of the golden age of pulp fiction. My sincere thanks to James for reading us this story today. It was really good. Well, that was episode number 600, and the show is officially 12 years and 2 months old. Not a long time in reality, but for a podcast, I think it's pretty amazing. I want to thank each and every one of you for sticking with me. Here's to 12 more years. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you will find any of the links I mentioned and how to contact us. Do you want to help the show? The best thing you can do is to tell your friends all about it, and please leave reviews or feedback wherever you listen. Clicking that follow or like button helps us grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.